Welcome folks to my channel. Today is Monday, and Mondays I usually try to have a sculpture that I'll work on for the week. Usually it's once every 2 weeks, sometimes once every week, depending on my needs. Now, I'm beginning to sculpture for our games, and one of our subscribers asked if I could please show how I make armatures. Now, I do have a couple of videos on my playlist that shows a little bit about armatures, but I'm going to do one more video, and we'll keep this as the go-to video on the playlist for armatures. Okay, so here is one of the Lizardman skellies that I have sculpted. Okay, and I actually have the sun coming in through one of the windows, so I have to be careful. I'm going to try to reduce the glare a bit, but you guys can see it, hopefully. Okay, now this figure I'm going to be using in my games, and of course this is a large figure, and basically this used an armature. It started with an armature. Okay, so here are a couple of other figures. Here's my turtle figure. And that's the cool thing about fantasy, is you can use, well, you can do whatever you want. You know, you can really mix and match body parts of animals if you wanted to, and come up with your own creatures, whatever the case is, right? And then, of course, here is Julie's favorite, and this was sculpted for Julie, Ernie. You guys will recognize Mr. Ernie from our Oathmark games, and this was sculpted to represent an Indrik in Oathmark. And I also have a giant wolver that I sculpted for Oathmark, and again, this is a very big figure. Okay, and I'm using the sun now to my advantage, but I'm gonna have to cut it so that it doesn't produce glare on the video. Okay, so there's that. So all those sculptures started with an armature. So let's talk a little bit about the wire, and I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of the theory first before I show the little sample armature that we're going to do. Okay, now this person, his main concern, this subscriber, their main concern was that the armature was just not steady enough on the base or whatever it is that they used. We'll talk a little bit about that as well, so hopefully I can answer that question. But one important thing is to look at the gauges of your wire. This one here is a 20 gauge. The higher the number, the thinner the wire. So, actually, I'm sorry, this is 18 gauge. 18 gauge, okay? This is 18 gauge. Sometimes I forget that. The higher the number, the thinner the wire. So this is 18 gauge, and I got this at Walmart in the necklace making section. It is great. I love it. It's cheap. All right, $1 something for the roll. It's cheap and it's very strong. It's 18 gauge, so it doesn't bend very much. So very good for sculpting. This is another wire. This one's about 20 gauge, and this was also from Walmart. I'm going to try to use the sun here to my advantage. Hopefully it's my advantage, okay? But you can kind of see the difference in thickness, okay? Now this one's 24 gauge, and this is about the same gauge of floral wire, okay? You see how thin this one is in comparison to that one, okay? And then, of course, floral wire. And this I got at Walmart as well. Now, this one's actually 26 gauge, okay? So this one's really thin. So floral wire is 26 gauge. So remember that. So this is 24 gauge. This one's a little bit thicker, okay? So those are the wires that I use. Pay attention to your gauge whenever you're sculpting figures. A little figure like this, I actually use the 18 gauge wire for this, okay? So, and that's tricky because this is all bone. So these are actually, it's trickier to sculpture skeletons for that reason, because you can't use a lot of filler on your wire because you're sculpting, you know, with very thin layers. Tools for making, one more thing. This is a wire that I get from Amazon. I've been using this for a lot of years now. And this comes in packs, and you get different sizes. You get 3 different gauges with these wires. They're very good. This is from Pendle Hall Elite. That's the company. And I find this on Amazon. And I get like 3 or 4 little packs of these in one order. And it really lasts me. And this is what I use to sculpture my dogs. When I sculpture people's dogs, this is the wire that I use. But now I use a whole combination, actually. All right, so let's talk about the base, where you're going to mount that little armature that we're going to make. And I love using the caps of rattle cans, spray paint cans. And reason is that, a lot of them have this kind of roughness on them, and this works very well for attaching your green stuff when you do the little base for the armature. So it really attaches it to the cap. And then once you're finished sculpting, of course, you have to kind of peel it off with an X-Acto knife very, very carefully with an X-Acto knife to get the figure off the bottle cap. But in addition, you notice those little holes that I drilled there. I drilled it with a a hand drill, little hobby drill. But I also use my Dremel from time to time, right? And I just puncture, make some thin holes there. And those are the holes where you're going to fit the wire when you build your armature. And then with your pliers, you're going to twist that a little bit to secure the wire to the figure. But in addition to that, you're going to use green stuff to really connect that wire to the base, okay? And this is a great handle, and that's why I like these, because they're nice and big. But so when I'm sculpting bigger, this is what I use. A lot of sculptors, what they use is cork, and this is a smaller cork, and larger cork actually, because you can use much smaller corks. The advantage of using a small base like this is that it kind of trains you to make the figure smaller, right? So if you use an even smaller cork, your armature is going to have to be small in order to fit on that cork. So this is a good way to train to kind of make smaller miniatures, right? You can see all the holes in there. I've punctured this a lot. And some people even make their bases out of wood. It's kind of like a vice grip. You have 2 pieces of wood and then have a screw and a nut that will tighten those 2 pieces of wood, and you have your figure in between, your armature. And that's a great little handle, for sculpting as well. All right, so that's the base. We're going to see that in a moment. I use my tweezers for bending very small wires, so things like elbows and things like that. I will sometimes use my bent little tweezers here. Small pliers for, obviously, for bending the wire. Cutters for cutting wire. And sometimes even my little model clipper. This is the one that snips off metal, and I'll use this to snip off very small wires, right, when I want the cuts to be more precise. So that's what I use. Also, sandpaper. Very important that you sand your armature, before actually putting clay. That creates a roughness all along the wire, and it really aids in sticking that green stuff onto it. Sometimes when you don't do that, the green stuff, regardless of how sticky it is, it won't stick very well to the smooth wire, and so you create gaps, which then weaken the figure. And sometimes as you're trying to roll the green stuff in there, it just doesn't stick well and it breaks apart. You can avoid all that by filing and by using very small, tiny amounts of green stuff and gradually building the shapes that you want. That's kind of what I've learned. Okay, so I'm speeding things up now so that the video is not too long. This is my collection of anatomical drawings that I've taken from online, and I have a very large collection of anatomical drawings, primarily the skeletons. And this is what I use to actually shape my armatures. I trace the backbone with the wire and actually bend it according to what I see in the skeleton. Now, a lot of times what I do is I double this wire so that I can shape the bottom of the rib cage as you see in the video. So this way it's like two wires. It will give me the entire shape of the rib cage, and then I join it right in between there, in between the hind legs and the rib cage. That's where I join the wires to get the shape that I want. Okay, now the middle part of the dog, these are excellent because you get an idea of how much skin, how much space you need between the wires that are your skeleton and the actual mass of the dog. Okay, and in these pictures you see these are actual maps of armatures. These were drawings that I got online of dogs, and they actually have the armatures already drawn on them. So you can use them as a template for making your armatures. I even do walruses and other creatures, and so basically these skeletons help me shape my wires so I can do almost any kind of animal, including a dinosaur. So there I shaped a wire like a T-Rex and etc. So this was a nice drawing that I got on Pinterest. You can Google it. Human sculpting, basically, is what I think I Googled. And it has all the different scales for human armatures, which are very useful. And there will be a large yak-like creature coming in the future. And I'm going to have a howdah on it so that I can fit figures. And that's basically what I was explaining here. But in order to get this giant yak creature, I'm going to be shaping not the outline of the backbone like you see there, but I have to go up higher so that I can get that effect of the hump on the creature's back. Sometimes what I'll do is we'll trace the exterior portion of the creature in order to get the exact shapes I want for the model. So that's coming in the future. So here is one of these skellies that I sculpted, and now we're going to make an armature of a skelly, and I'll show you an example of how I make the armature. So I bend my wire. This is going to be my primary wire, okay, and I use my pliers to make sure I get it nice and crisp. My bends, I want them nice and crisp, okay, and I do this, make sure that the wire is as straight as I can get it. Okay, and then I also match it against the skelly figure that I already made. And what I do is I bend the very tip and kind of mark where the shoulders on the figure are and where the hips are. That's because I want this figure to be a similar size to my other skellies. So I bend a little area to mount the skull and also for the neck. And then I bend the areas that are going to be the hip. And for this, I use my pliers. Okay, and then I bend the wire around the plier. I don't actually move the plier. I secure the wire and then bend the wire along the very tip of a needle nose plier, and that gives me the hip that I want, okay? And I compare it to the figure every so often since I'm not doing any measurements. I give the backbone an S-shape configuration because I find that the figure comes out a lot better when you do that. It's a lot more natural looking. So now I bend the knees for this future skelly, okay, and I compare it to my other figure. And then I go ahead and I bend what would be the ankles in this kind of figure because of the, the way these are not human. These are lizard men. They have that long kind of those ankle bones, okay, that go the opposite way of the knee. Then I bend the feet, and now all the wire past the feet are going to be anchor wires. These are the wires that I will insert into the base. And you see that I leave the foot wire very long. Okay. And now I'm preparing to make the arms. And I measured about 8 inches of wire for the arms. Okay, I always give it a little more than you need. It's better to have more than less. And then I loop this wire around the base of the neck when I've determined where the neck is going to be. And then this will secure the arms and shoulders to the body. Tightening it. Okay, so basically just tie that floral wire around so that it secures the arm. Now, you have to be careful because you don't want this to create too much bulk and then you have nowhere to put your clay. So you just got to be careful with this step. All right, and that that should be enough. Okay, I just want to secure it a little bit. And then cut the excess. But I don't want it too bulky there because that'll just ruin, especially if I'm working with a skeletal figure. Okay, and it still has a little bit of movement, so we're going to deal with that in just a minute. Now, I recommend you use green stuff for this next step. I bought a black colored Avi's clay, which I use Avi's, but it's not very good because it leaves a black residue. So I would recommend using green stuff for this part. You use a little green stuff to basically cement the shoulders and the arms to the body. Okay, and make sure that it's as thin as possible so you're not bulking that area up. And then you're going to let that dry 24 hours and that will harden those areas. Okay, and now for the tail on the lizard man, I measure it up and I use some floral wire to attach the tail portion, right? And then I usually go through the front and bend the tail down towards the back, like you see in the video. Okay, and then I trim my tail. And I like my lizardman tails long. So now I insert those extra wires into the base. And with my pliers, I bend them and I clip them a little bit. And then I make sure that I bend them so that they really grip the base. Then I use green stuff to cement the entire armature to the base. I create a little base for it, basically. And that I let dry so that the green stuff will then secure the armature. I also use a little bit of crazy glue to cement the tail. This will ensure that the tail stays on the body. Okay, and I do some comparing with my other skelly. Now, this is an example of a quadruped animal, and this is going to be a Hydra. And for quadruped animals, like a dog or a Hydra, I use my skeletal anatomy pictures. And again, like I said earlier, I bend the wire and shape it according to the skeleton using the outline of the rib cage, the backbone, the tail, you know, and I leave the neck, leave a little section to attach the skull. Right? It's usually around, I have the wire so that it goes towards the orbit of the skull. This will create enough attachment point to attach the skull later. Then I wrap floral wire along the entire body of the armature. And that will not only strengthen the armature, but it has attachment points for clay. Now, for the most part, I use tinfoil filler for these kinds of figures, and that little mesh of floral wire that I make around the armature will help attach the tinfoil as well. And for the legs, this is the forelegs. I do the exact same thing. I shape them separately, including the scapular bone. There you go, and then notice that the scapular bone is at an angle when I attach it to the body of the sculpture. And I do this for fantasy creatures as well. And this is a good tool for measuring. Very good tool for measuring. Now, this next project is going to be this week's project, and I am planning a giant Mosasaur. It's a sea reptile. And here is the armature for that figure. And it's going to have an old Mage Knight figure on the top of it. Okay, so I'm going to find a way to attach it. And here is, I have secured the armature to my bottle cap. I hope that really helps you guys, and for my subscriber who asked about the armatures, I hope that helps. One thing, you got to make sure you're using the correct gauge of wire. I use 18 gauge mostly, even for some of the smaller figures. If you want to go smaller, then you may have to adjust the gauge of the wire. That means the wire is going to be a lot more flexible. So you have to think about those things when you do it. I use 18 gauge. You also want to make sure you have enough wire on the limbs, very long, right? So that you can stick it into your base, whatever that's going to be. And depending on what you use, you may have to adjust that wire that's going to serve as anchor, right? So if you're using cork, maybe you use a little bit smaller, right, wire for your anchor, but you want to have enough length beneath the feet that you can kind of twist it. And then I go back and I add a little bit of green stuff. Use green stuff. Don't use the colored Avies. I don't think that's going to be very good. It leaves a residue. If you're going to use Avies, Avies is great clay. I use the regular one without the colors. And then that I use to mix with my green stuff, and I change the properties and all that. That clay mixtures, that's a whole other thing. But you take your green stuff and then you secure your armature to the base with the green stuff. And you also use green stuff to secure some of the joints. Or even a little bit of crazy glue. That also works very well. I do that for my lizardmen with the tails. So I take inspiration from sculptors like Tom Mason, who's done some work for the Mercs game, or he actually sculpted the figures for Mercs. He has a website here on YouTube. Check him out. Shop around. Look at as many sculptors as you can and get ideas from everyone. Everyone has their own techniques across the board, right? What they like to do. So he is one of the people I really look up to. And then there's stormthecastle.com. He's been around for a while. He has some great little advice on making armatures. He was the person that really inspired me, in the beginning a few years back. So check his stuff out too. All right, folks, have a great one, and we'll talk very soon.